Apothetae BC. A Spartan elder stands on a moonlit cliff, a newborn dangling from his hands above the abyss. The baby screams into the night. Behind him the mother watches, trembling, silent, forbidden to move, forbidden to plead. The elder studies the infant like a craftsman, inspecting raw material, checking limbs, spine, jawline. One imperfection, one flaw, and the child vanishes into the darkness below, falling nearly 2,400 feet onto the rocks. But here's the part that history books soften or skip entirely. That was only the beginning, because what Sparta built wasn't a culture. It was an experiment, a 300-year-long social laboratory where human beings were engineered, regulated, and discarded like livestock. And for centuries, historians have romanticized it, calling it discipline, courage, honor, when in truth, it was one of the earliest state-run eugenics programs in human history. Here's what you're about to uncover in the next few minutes. First, how Sparta practiced state-mandated genetic selection 2,500 years before Nazi Germany, and why most people have never heard the full truth. Second, how Spartan women were legally required to sleep with men who weren't their husbands, and how the state enforced it. And third, why the children who passed the cliff inspection were often condemned to fates even worse than those who didn't. By the end of this story, you'll understand something chilling. This breeding system didn't forge an empire. It quietly destroyed one, and if you're fascinated by how far ancient societies went in pursuit of creating the perfect soldier, hit subscribe. Because what follows gets darker with every minute. Now close your eyes for a second. Imagine a world where every decision, who you marry, when you conceive, even whether your baby lives or dies, is dictated by the state. Not for religion, not for morality, but for one purpose only: manufacturing the ultimate warrior. From around 650 to 350 BC, Sparta stood as one of the most feared powers in ancient Greece. While Athens nurtured democracy and philosophy, Sparta built something entirely different, a war machine. Every male citizen was a full-time soldier from the age of 7 until 60. Think about that. 53 years of mandatory military service. But what schools never tell you is this: it wasn't a proud tradition. It was law. It was policy. And it was brutally enforced. These doctrines were laid down by a semi-mythical lawgiver named Lycurgus, a man whose decrees shaped every breath of Spartan life. The ruling class, the Spartiates, made up less than 10% of the population. Beneath them were about 30,000 free non-citizens, artisans, traders, farmers. And beneath them, more than 200,000 helot slaves, a population 7 times larger, constantly on the brink of rebellion. To survive, Sparta needed soldiers capable of controlling a hostile majority. And so the state turned to something monstrous: controlled breeding. They didn't encourage it. They didn't reward it. They mandated it. Spartans were bred the way other societies bred war horses. The legendary warriors of Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans we glorize today, were products of this system. They were, quite literally, government-engineered, and the program ran in 3 brutal stages, each more disturbing than the last. The first began within days of birth. It's where our story returns, to that cliff. Picture this: you've just given birth. You're exhausted, trembling, clutching your newborn. Then within 24 hours, armed officials arrive at your door. No permission, no compassion. They take your baby and march toward a place called the Apothetae, the place of rejection. There, 5 elders, the Gerousia, inspect every Spartan infant, citizen by citizen. They check for strong bones, clear eyes, proportionate features, the marks of a future warrior. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, writing 5 centuries later, the babies who failed this inspection were carried to the cliffs of Mount Taygetus and thrown from the rocks. The mother never saw her child again. For generations, this became the cornerstone of the Spartan myth: survival of the fittest, natural selection before Darwin. It fit the image perfectly: Sparta, the land of ruthless perfection. But here's the twist no one tells you. In 1998, archaeologists finally excavated the base of that mountain, expecting to find piles of infant bones. Instead, they found almost nothing. A few adult remains, some teenage bones, but no infants, meaning the story might never have been true. Historians now believe the tale was exaggerated, propaganda by Sparta's enemies, or later, historians eager to brand them as monsters. So what really happened to the rejected children? The truth is lost to time. Some scholars think they were abandoned outside the city to die naturally, or quietly adopted by helot families desperate for children. Others suggest the rejection rate was smaller than we imagine. After all, Sparta needed warriors, not mass graves. But here's the part that truly freezes the blood. The babies who passed inspection weren't lucky. They weren't protected. They were property. That moment on the cliff wasn't the end of their suffering. It was the beginning. Because passing the test didn't mean you were special. It meant you were useful. And from that moment forward, your entire existence would be dedicated to one purpose: to breed, fight, and die as the state's perfect creation. And this is where Sparta's laws cross the line from brutal to unthinkable. You think that cliff was extreme? What I'm about to show you is how Sparta transformed marriage itself into a state-run breeding program, and why Spartan women had more sexual freedom than any other women in the ancient world. But for the most disturbing reasons imaginable. Picture this: a 35-year-old Spartan warrior steps into his home after training. He opens the door and finds his 22-year-old wife lying in bed with another man. The man is younger, maybe 25, a rising champion fresh from the battlefield, his body built for war. Does the husband rage? Challenge him to a duel? No, he simply closes the door and leaves them alone. Because he arranged it. And no, this isn't rumor or enemy propaganda. This was Spartan law, documented in detail by Xenophon, Plutarch and Polybius. If a man was older, weaker, or past his prime, the state encouraged him, even expected him, to lend his wife to a younger, stronger warrior during her fertile years. The goal wasn't love. It wasn't companionship. It was offspring with superior genetics. The child born from this union legally belonged to the husband, but everyone knew the biological truth. And that's where things get darker still. Unlike women in Athens, who lived hidden away and silenced inside their homes, Spartan women could choose the warriors they wanted to breed with. If a woman saw a decorated soldier, a champion wrestler, or a man of extraordinary physique, she could approach him. And not only was it accepted, it was celebrated. The husband approved. The state approved. Society approved. Because in Sparta, marriage wasn't a bond between lovers. It was a contract between bloodlines. Every union had a single purpose: to produce the next generation of perfect soldiers. And the state didn't just encourage selective breeding, it enforced it. Men who refused to marry were publicly humiliated. They were banned from certain festivals, stripped of political privileges, and sometimes marched naked through the agora, the town square, in the freezing cold, while women jeered and mocked them. Those who married too late were fined. Those who failed to produce children were investigated, interrogated, to see if the failure was due to health or rebellion. Think about what that means. Your worth as a Spartan wasn't measured by your mind, your morality, or your courage. It was measured by your genes and your obedience to reproduce. This wasn't tradition. It was eugenics, 2,500 years before the term even existed. Centuries before Darwin, before Galton, before Nazi Germany, Sparta was conducting one of the earliest, most organized genetic engineering programs in history. And for nearly 2 centuries, it worked. Sparta produced warriors so feared that enemy armies surrendered at the mere sight of their crimson cloaks. So disciplined that 300 of them held off a Persian army numbering in the hundreds of thousands at Thermopylae. But here's where the story turns even darker. Because everything I've told you so far, the cliff inspections, the breeding laws, the forced eugenics, was just the preparation phase. The true brutality of the Spartan system didn't begin until a child reached the age of 7. Picture it. You're a 7-year-old boy. You've spent your short life surrounded by your mother and sisters. You sleep in a warm bed. You eat when you're hungry. You laugh. You play. Then one morning, soldiers arrive. They don't explain. They don't comfort you. They drag you from your mother's arms as she screams, and she is powerless to stop them. You are taken to a communal barracks filled with other terrified boys. You'll never see your family again, because this is your new home, the Agoge, 13 years of relentless military conditioning. And what you're about to hear makes modern boot camps look like summer retreats. Stage 1. Breaking the child. For the first 3 years, you live under the command of older boys, brutal, merciless, and given full authority to discipline you. You sleep on a bed of reeds. You're forced to harvest yourself barehanded. No tools, no shoes. One cloak, no underwear. In the winter, you freeze. In the summer, you burn. And then comes the starvation protocol, the rule that historians still debate to this day. Boys were deliberately underfed. Not enough to stunt growth, just enough to keep them hungry. Always hungry, why? To force them to steal. If you stole and got away with it, you were clever, a survivor. If you stole and got caught, you were savagely beaten, not for the theft, but for your failure to deceive. The most famous story tells of a boy who hid a live fox under his cloak. As it clawed and shredded his stomach, he stayed silent, dying without a sound rather than admit his crime. Whether that story is fact or legend doesn't matter. What matters is that Sparta wanted its people to believe it should be true. Stage 2, the Cryptia. At 18, the best of these boys were chosen for something darker, Sparta's secret police. They were given only a knife and sent into the countryside, not to hunt animals, but to hunt helots, the slave population that outnumbered Spartans 7-1. For weeks, these teenage warriors hid by day and hunted by night. Not animals, but humans. Their targets were the helots, the enslaved population that fed Sparta. The strongest, smartest, and most defiant among them were marked for death. The boys would creep through the fields, through the shadows, and slit their throats as they slept, sometimes in front of their families. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't hazing. It was policy. State-sanctioned murder, a rite of passage. The historian Plutarch called it utterly abhorrent. But for Sparta, it was necessary. It kept the helots terrified, submissive, and it taught these young killers something crucial, that taking a human life was no different than slaughtering livestock. Stage 3. The final test. At age 20, after 13 years of relentless brutality, a Spartan boy faced his final ordeal, the altar of Artemis Orthia. Here, ritual whipping wasn't a punishment, it was a performance. Boys were lashed until they bled, sometimes until they died as their families and citizens watched. The goal, endure without a scream. If you cried out, your name became a curse. If you died in silence, you became a legend. By 20, if you survived, you weren't human anymore. You were a weapon. But here's what no one tells you. This entire system, this machinery of breeding, selection, and sanctioned killing, had one fatal flaw. A flaw so devastating it didn't just weaken Sparta. It annihilated it, and that flaw, it was mathematical. I know this is dark. But if you're still here, you're like me, fascinated by the brutal truths that history hides. Stories like this never make it into school books because they're too disturbing, too complex, too real. That's exactly why I tell them. So if you haven't already, subscribe, because next week I'm exposing the horrifying secret behind Rome's gladiator breeding programs. And trust me, they weren't volunteers. Now, let's go back to Sparta and watch how it all collapsed. Here's the irony that ended 300 years of dominance. Sparta's breeding program worked too well. By 480 BC, the time of the legendary 300 at Thermopylae, Sparta had around 8,000 full citizens. Warriors born from generations of selective breeding and merciless training. the best fighters the world had ever seen. But by 371 BC, barely a century later, only 1,000 remained. No plague, no foreign invasion, just a silent extinction. How does a society lose 87% of its warrior class without losing a war? The answer, oliganthropia, the shortage of men. Problem 1, Sparta's warriors became too valuable to risk. They were so elite that losing even 50 in a campaign was a demographic disaster. So Sparta stopped fighting. The society built for war became terrified of war itself. They negotiated instead of invaded, preserved instead of conquered. Problem 2, inheritance laws created poverty. Spartan citizenship required owning land and funding communal meals. Over generations, property concentrated in fewer hands. Warriors who couldn't pay lost their status. Their sons couldn't train. The breeding pool shrank. Problem 3, the mathematics of selective breeding. When you only allow the strongest to reproduce, your numbers collapse. Sparta's obsession with purity destroyed its diversity, and with it, its survival. Meanwhile, the helots, the slaves, multiplied. By 370 BC, they outnumbered Spartans 7-1. Imagine being one of 1,000 warriors, controlling 200,000 people who hated you, who remembered every murder, every whipping, every child you slaughtered during the Crypteia. Sparta became a prison, and the guards were outnumbered 200-1. The breaking point came at the Battle of Leuctra, 371 BC. For 6 centuries, Sparta had never lost a major land battle. Then came Thebes, not a great empire, just a city-state with a smarter tactic. They struck Sparta's left flank, and in a single afternoon, 400 Spartans fell. 400 out of 1,000! Sparta never recovered. Within 50 years, their warriors were gone. Their traditions turned into spectacles for Roman tourists. Visitors came to watch ritual whippings the same way we watch historical reenactments. The men who once ruled the battlefield became a museum exhibit. Here's the fatal truth. Sparta engineered the perfect soldier, but forgot how to build a society. They optimized for strength, discipline, and war, and in doing so erased everything else that makes a civilization survive. Farmers, craftsmen, thinkers, artists, and above all, children. Their genetic experiment didn't create an empire. It created a ticking time bomb. And when it exploded, the most feared warriors in history vanished almost overnight. So what does Sparta teach us? That you can engineer humans for perfection, but you can't engineer humanity itself. You can build a civilization around a single purpose, but you can't escape the math. Sparta's true legacy isn't their victories. It's their extinction. They proved that human beings aren't machines you can fine-tune without consequences. Every trait you optimize comes with a hidden cost, one you never see until it's too late. The warriors we glorify, the 300 Spartans, the crimson-cloaked phalanx, the men who shouted, "Come and take them," weren't born from heroism. They were forged through 300 years of controlled breeding, ritualized violence, and state-sponsored cruelty. And that system didn't make them invincible. It erased them. So here's the question I want you to wrestle with. Really think about it. Can selective breeding ever create the perfect soldier? Or does war, real human warfare, demand adaptability, creativity, and chaos, the very things a breeding program wipes out? Tell me what you think in the comments. I actually read them, and if this story hit you, wait until next week's video. We're diving into Rome's gladiator breeding farms, where human beings were literally bred like livestock and auctioned off to die for entertainment. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss that one. I'll see you in the next story.